So let's talk about the global entrepreneurs, wherein this is an outbreak that has affected every single entrepreneur in the entire world, isn't it? So
Yes.
this is also a time that I started, wondering what could be some really good business model that we could adopt post-COVID. So my question to you is, how can we come up with a recession-proof business model?
Well, if I knew the answer to that question, I would have published a paper on it, but I will try to answer that. And it's a very relevant question in today's time. And I can share my examples. I mean, it's since 2012, 13, when I was previously doing finance recruitment, I have been running multiple organizations in the last 8 years. The latest is Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil for the last 2, 3 years. But let me share with you my journey as an entrepreneur for the last 8 years and more recently with RSPO. When I started with the Human Circle in 2014, and great friends like you and others who supported me in doing that right from the beginning, we realized that we cannot look at businesses for 5 years with an objective to sell it off and make money. I'm not saying that that is wrong or right, but I did not choose to go that way. For me, it was more important to build something that lasts beyond me. That is something which will run when I'm not there in this world, which means I was already thinking at the beginning 10, 20, 30 years and not 1, 2, 3 years. I think that is the first foundation to lay as to create a sustainable business model. To not think of it as just a profit making enterprise, because if profit making was the objective, you can do a lot of things, right? Like you can run a lot of for profit businesses for which you don't have to be an entrepreneur. You could be running your family business, for example. If you don't have that, you can join another business and get paid a high salary. The reason people choose to be entrepreneurs is because they want to create something which is larger than themselves, right? Like this organization, this cause which drives us. So I think that is the first point I want to make, that the foundation has to be long-term and very strong. And the why has to be very clear as to why you're starting it. And connecting it to sustainability again. So if your goal was in 5 years, let's maximize the profit and not care for the environment from where I'm sourcing my products, or the workers who are not paid properly, or if there are any human rights violation along the supply chain, right? So while that might benefit you in 5 years, your consciousness will ask you the same question when you will move on to your next big thing of at what cost are you moving to your next startup or your next job, because you're guilty of it, right? I mean, and in the Indian culture, I know how powerful the concept of karma is. And we know it works in the same lifetime. So if you're going to damage human beings' life or nature itself, you are going to pay back at some stage. So I don't want to make it philosophical, but I just want to make it a point that what goes around comes around. So sustainable business model means to keep in mind your source, your supply base. So that supplier who is supplying to you, how is the health of his or her business? So just to take another example, right? Another story of a business sourcing, Indian business sourcing something from China, or American business sourcing something from China. Now, can you imagine? There is research which I have been reading, and more and more will get published again. Now, think of it this way. The entire American economy, a huge chunk of it is based on Chinese manufacturing that happens in China, because all the factories are moved from the western part of the world to India, China, Philippines, so on and so forth. So think of it at the global level now. Now, if you and I in India and US, for example, are not going to keep in mind what's happening with the organizations in China, we are setting ourselves up for disaster. And economists are telling us that it's time for the world to look at the qualitative aspect of economic growth, not just the quantitative aspect of it. Like think of countries like Bhutan, for example, right? It's a classic case. Bhutan has had a gross domestic happiness index for decades now. And the Scandinavian world came around it. So now they have some other parameters to judge the economic growth on qualitative aspects. But
Which
why
is
not India?
happiness of citizens, right?
Yes, exactly. And not just of the citizen, happiness of the planet, like of that country, of nature, of the health of the forest, for example, right?
Okay.
Health of the animals, for that matter.
Wow.
So to wrap up that thought, what I was saying was that we live in a global supply chain. Taking palm palm's example as well. Like palm oil is grown in Malaysia and Indonesia. 90% of it comes from it. India is the largest importer of palm oil in the world because it's the most efficient and affordable commodity. And what we say is that the only alternate to palm oil is sustainable palm oil. Because if the world moves to sunflower, soy, or others, it takes 4 to 10 times of land, water, and other resources. So if I look at it, my own work, right? Like if I think of it as India as a country and I'm buying from Malaysia, Indonesia, I know that there are forest fires that are happening in Indonesia, Australia, Siberia, Amazon in Brazil, you name it, right? The last 12 months, we have seen the worst forest fires. So if you're an entrepreneur sourcing something from China, Malaysia, Indonesia, isn't this common sense? And forget about philosophy. Isn't this common sense for me to think that I should protect my supplies in Indonesia? Because if we don't protect them or incentivize them to give me sustainable palm oil, they then have no choice probably to then go burn down a forest or to do something totally unsustainable, in which case my business will no longer survive 5 years from now because my supply base is affected, right? So
Right.
same for China, same for Indonesia. So sustainable business model needs to be built keeping in mind the entire supply chain, which
Okay.
means all the way to the source, all the way to China, all the way to Wuhan, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Jakarta, wherever you buy from, wherever you source from. And even if your business is limited to India or limited to the US or limited to a European country, you must think of the source in your own country as well. Maybe you're sourcing from a village, maybe you're sourcing from a small entrepreneur out there. So think of the health of the business of your suppliers as well, or your clients as well, and not just your own.
This is perfect. So in essence, you are saying that the entrepreneurship is all about creating an ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem, right? Which,
Yes.
so a lot of business owners, they think about the business only in terms of profits that they can make by selling a resource at a lower, buying from at a lower cost and selling at a higher price. But when you really
Right.
look into it, when you look at the suppliers, the real the grassroots levels wherein the real work is happening, right? It could be talent, it could be raw materials, whatever it is. You actually, in essence, creating an ecosystem, right?
Absolutely. Healthy
Families,
ecosystem. Yeah.
healthy
And
ecosystem, and families dependent on it.
yeah, and so many employment being generated, right? As entrepreneurs, you have the opportunity to create so many direct as well as indirect employment opportunities. And that's a great work that entrepreneurs do around the world. And we must recognize and appreciate the entrepreneurs to do it. But now let's take this conversation in the post-COVID-19 world. Now,
Okay.
what do you think is going to happen? Now, let's say the world comes back to some normal behavior in 2 months, 3 months, or 6 months. At some stage, we will recover from this, right? That is what the most likelihood is. So in the post-COVID world, if you're looking at running your business and not caring about your talent, your employees, your suppliers, then you're doing a disservice not just to yourself and your business, but also as a responsible global citizen. Because what you're essentially saying is that, yeah, that pandemic happened, we are over it now, and let's go business as usual. That will be one of the biggest mistakes. If anyone thinks that there'll be business as usual after this, there will be no business as usual, because the whole world will shift to a new realization that the healthy ecosystem needs to be created. It's like you don't have a choice about it. And I think my sense is that even the governments are going to incentivize that behavior. My sense is that governments across the world are going to ask businesses and entrepreneurs to actually look at their policies. If it was for me to promote, I would make it mandatory for every business to have a sustainable sourcing policy. Because without a sustainable sourcing policy, you cannot hold businesses accountable for it. Because I could be a business in India, China, US, Europe, anywhere. And if I don't even have a sustainable sourcing policy, what is my parameter to judge whether I'm sourcing responsibly or I'm sourcing irresponsibly?
Kamal, if we as a species do not learn from this outbreak and this incident, then there must be no bigger fools than us, isn't it?
Well, we will pay a price for it. We'll pay a huge price for
We'll
it.
pay, of
Some
course.
people will pay that price within their own families. Some people will pay in their neighborhood, in their city, in their country. But there is going to be a huge chain reaction if we don't learn from this, because there is nothing to say that SARS happened in 2004 or 3. There was a tsunami around the same time, if you remember. It's within 15 years, and in between there was an Ebola, right? So it's not coming from nowhere. It's showing you a trend. that
Yes.
every 5 years, every 5 to 10 years, something is structurally wrong with the global economy right now, because of which these epidemics are coming up. It's not
Right.
coming from a vacuum. It's coming from human behavior and business behavior, which is not sustainable.
Kamal, this reminds me of the conversations that we used to have a few years ago. If you don't learn the lesson that life has taught you, then the life is not going to stop until you learn
Yes,
that lesson,
absolutely. It's
isn't
it's
it?
our ancient wisdom across cultures. Life will keep
Right.
giving you the same lesson till it is convinced that you have got the lesson. So
Correct.
if you did not learn from a COVID-19, be prepared for another one coming in the next 5 to 10 years or even faster than that.